They say you can tell everything about a person by how they treat someone who can do absolutely nothing for them. For 3 years, I let my daughter-in-law, Violet, and her father, Philemon Walters, believe I was that person. To them, I was just Winfield Curtis, a 75-year-old retiree living in a shack on Thamwi Lump Street. A man surviving on a modest government pension who spent his days looking at old coins and fussing over his garden. I was the harmless grandfather. The man who was too old to be relevant and too quiet to be a threat. I didn't mind the role. In fact, after 35 years of living in the darkest corners of the human soul, I craved the anonymity. But there is a specific kind of danger in underestimating a man who has spent his life studying the mechanics of guilt. I hadn't seen my son, Titus, in 3 months when the invitation finally came. It wasn't a call, and it didn't come from him. It was a text from Violet. Short, clinical, and devoid of a single hello. Dinner Sunday. Sao, Bamui. Be on time. I drove to their craftsman home in Ballard, through the typical Seattle drizzle, my chest tight with a hope I knew better than to trust. At my age, you learn that silence from family usually means a storm is brewing, not that the skies have cleared. As I pulled up to the curb, I saw my grandson's bicycle lying in the grass, half hidden by overgrown weeds. I'd bought that bike for his birthday last year, the party I wasn't invited to. It was a small, stinging reminder that I had been systematically archived from their lives. Violet answered the door. Her smile was a masterpiece of social engineering. It was bright, symmetrical, and didn't reach her eyes by a nautical mile. Winfield, you're actually on time, she said, stepping aside. She didn't call me Dad, or even Curtis, like she used to. My name was just a label she used to acknowledge a package she was forced to sign for. Good to see you, Violet, I said, stepping into the warmth of the house. I could smell pot roast, the same meal I'd taught Titus to cook when he was 10. Then I saw him. Titus was standing in the dining room, and for a second, I didn't recognize my own son. He had always been lean, but now he looked brittle. There were dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes, and his shoulders were hunched forward as if he were perpetually bracing for a blow that hadn't landed yet. When our eyes met, I saw a flash of something. It wasn't joy. It was a warning. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice thin. He hugged me, and I felt the prominent ridge of his spine. He was disappearing. "You look like you've been working too hard, son," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He's been freelancing," Violet interjected, her tone dripping with a condescension so thick it was a wonder she didn't choke on it. Which is just a fancy word for sitting in a dark room playing with pictures while the bills pile up. "It's graphic design, Violet. I have steady clients," Titus said quietly, but he didn't look at her. He looked at the floor. We sat down to dinner. The table was set with the fine-boned china I'd given them for their wedding 5 years ago. I remembered writing the check for that wedding. Heimui Lum. Hum. It had been a gift to help them start their lives without debt. That day, Violet had clung to my arm, calling me her hero, and telling everyone who would listen how lucky she was to marry into such a distinguished family. Looking at her now, watching her pick at her roast with a look of practiced boredom, I realized that the woman at the wedding had been a character she'd played until the check cleared. The front door opened without a knock. The heavy thud of work boots on hardwood announced the arrival of the man who had become the architect of my son's misery. Philemon Walters walked into the dining room without an invitation, still wearing his work jacket with Walters Construction LLC stitched across the breast. He was a broad man, red-faced and loud, the kind of person who confused volume with authority. "Sweetheart," he said, kissing Violet's cheek. He ignored Titus entirely, then turned his gaze toward me. "Winfield. Still rotting away in that dump on Thamwi Lumpth. I see." "It's a comfortable home, Philemon," I replied, my voice a practiced neutral. "Must be hard to maintain anything better on a government check, I suppose. Low expectations run in the family, don't they?" He pulled out a chair, my chair, the one at the head of the table, and sat down. I felt the first spark of the old fire in my gut. For decades, I had faced down cartel leaders and corrupt politicians who used the same bullying tactics. Philemon was a small-time amateur compared to the monsters I'd put behind bars, but he had something they didn't. He had my son's spirit in a vice. "I've been telling Titus here," Philemon continued, stabbing a piece of meat with his fork, "that he needs to stop this computer nonsense. I offered him a spot on my crew, real labor, something that earns a man a right to stand tall, but he'd rather play with his little art projects. Titus is a talented designer, I said. He's built a reputation. Philemon let out a harsh, barking laugh. Reputation? In what? The I can't pay my mortgage industry? He's a failure, Winfield, just like you. You spent your life pushing paper for the government, and look what you have to show for it. A pension that barely covers your property taxes, and a son who can't even look his wife in the eye. Violet didn't defend her husband. She didn't even flinch. She just took a sip of her wine and nodded. Dad's right, Titus. We've talked about this. You're joining the construction firm on Monday. I've already drafted the resignation emails for your clients. Titus's head snapped up. You did what? Violet, those are contracts. I have legal obligations. You have an obligation to provide for this family, she snapped. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with a static that made the hair on my arms stand up. I watched my son. I watched the way he shrank, the way his hands trembled under the table. This wasn't just a marital spat. This was a systematic dismantling of a human being. I looked around the room, really looked this time. The photos on the mantel were all of Violet's family. Her parents, her siblings, her successes. My grandson was there, but Titus was absent from almost every frame. My son was being erased in his own home. Is that why I was invited tonight? I asked, my voice dropping into a register I hadn't used in years. To witness a foreclosure on my son's soul. Philemon leaned across the table, his face inches from mine. You were invited so you could see what a real man looks like, Winfield. And so you could tell your son to stop acting like a coward, and take the job I'm giving him, because if he doesn't, he's out. Violet is done with him, and I'm done paying for this roof over his head. You don't pay for this roof, I said calmly. Titus and Violet own this home. Philemon smirked. Check the filings, old man. I bailed them out of a freelance hole 6 months ago. I hold the deed now. Titus is a guest in my house. I looked at Titus. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The shame was a physical weight on him. He had been so desperate to keep his family together that he'd signed over his autonomy to a narcissist and a bully. I need some air, Titus whispered, pushing back his chair. Sit down, Philemon barked. I need a minute. Titus stood up, his face pale. Philemon was on his feet in a second. He was a big man, fueled by the arrogance of a person who had never been told no by someone he couldn't intimidate. He grabbed Titus by the shoulder and shoved him. It wasn't a playful shove. It was violent. Titus stumbled back, his heel catching on the leg of his chair, and he went down hard. The sound of his body hitting the hardwood floor was a dull, sickening thud. I started to rise, but what happened next froze the blood in my veins. As Titus struggled to sit up, his face etched with shock and pain, Philemon stepped forward and slapped him. The crack of palm against cheek echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. It was a deliberate, humiliating strike, intended to break whatever was left of my son's dignity. And then, I heard it. Violet laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was a sharp, mocking sound of genuine amusement. Thanks, Dad, she said, leaning back in her chair with a smirk. Maybe that will finally teach him to listen when the adults are talking. Titus stayed on the floor, his hand pressed to his reddening face, his eyes welling with tears he was too broken to shed. He looked at his wife, the woman he had spent 5 years trying to please, and saw only contempt. The room went deathly quiet. Philemon was breathing hard, looking down at Titus with a grotesque sense of triumph. He turned to me, expecting what? Fear? Submission? Sometimes you have to use a firm hand, Winfield, Philemon said, straightening his jacket. Old school discipline. You probably never had the guts for it. I stood up slowly. I didn't feel old. I didn't feel like a retiree on a pension. I felt the familiar, cold clarity that used to settle over me right before I stepped into a courtroom to dismantle a criminal's life. The Winfield, they thought they knew the harmless old man was gone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. What are you doing? Violet asked, her laughter dying as she saw the expression on my face. Calling an ambulance for your poor boy? I didn't answer her. I didn't even look at her. I looked at Philemon, who was still wearing that arrogant, stupid smirk. He had no idea that he hadn't just hit a man. He had just handed me the opening statement of the most important case of my life. I dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. It wasn't Chinchum Mote. It was a direct line to a man who owed me everything. Marcus, I said when the line picked up. My voice was a low, vibrating hum of pure ice. This is Winfield Curtis. I'm at Song in Namchum Bonmui Bai, Haimui Bonth Avenue. I need a tactical unit and a domestic violence advocate on scene immediately. I've just witnessed an assault, and I'm about to begin a discovery process that is going to burn a construction company to the ground. Philemon's smirk flickered. Who the hell are you talking to? I looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time, he saw it. He saw the predator behind the bifocals. He saw the 35 years of federal authority I had been keeping in the shadows. I'm talking to the man who's going to process your arrest, Philemon, I said. And as for who I am, you're about to find out that you've spent the last 3 years insulting the only man who could have saved you from what's coming next. I looked down at my son, who was staring up at me in total shock. Stay on the floor, Titus, I said softly. Don't move. I want the officers to see exactly what they did to you. The room was silent, but the air was screaming. I didn't know it yet, but that slap was the most expensive mistake Philemon Walters would ever make. It was going to cost him his business, his freedom, and his daughter's future. I hadn't seen Titus in 3 months, but by the time I was finished, Philemon wouldn't see the outside of a cell for a long, long time. I could see the gears turning in Philemon's thick skull, grinding against the friction of his own arrogance. He looked at the phone in my hand, then back at my face, trying to find the harmless old man he'd spent the last 3 years mocking. He didn't find him. He found the man who had looked into the eyes of cartel enforcers and didn't blink. Tactical unit, Philemon spat, though the bravado was starting to fray at the edges. Who the hell do you think you are, Winfield? You're a retired clerk. A nobody. You call your little friends at the precinct, and what? They're going to arrest me for giving my son-in-law a wake-up call in my own house? It's not your house, Philemon, I said, my voice dropping into that rhythmic courtroom cadence that used to make defense attorneys break into a cold sweat. And I wasn't a clerk. I was the lead prosecutor for the Western District. I've spent more time in judges' chambers than you've spent on job sites. And Marcus Reed? He's not a friend. He's a detective in the domestic violence unit, who owes his career to a case I handed him on a silver platter 5 years ago. Violet let out a sharp, nervous titter. A prosecutor? Winfield, you live in a house with a leaky roof and drive a 10-year-old Buick. You collect pennies. If you were some big-shot lawyer, you wouldn't be living like a beggar. I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the greed, the shallow estimation of worth based on shiny objects and loud talk. I felt a pang of guilt, deep and sharp. I had let this happen. I had been so protective of my peace, so desperate to leave the prosecutor persona behind, that I had allowed my son to marry a predator because I was too busy being retired. I don't collect pennies, Violet, I said softly. I collect history, and I live the way I do because I spent 30 years seeing what happens to people who obsess over the appearance of wealth, people like your father. I looked down at Titus. He had managed to sit up, leaning his back against the mahogany sideboard. His face was a map of confusion and burgeoning hope. He had spent his whole life knowing me as the quiet dad who liked gardening and old history books. He didn't know about the nights I spent under federal protection. He didn't know that the old coins he saw me cataloging were worth more than the house he was sitting in. Dad, he whispered, is that true, the prosecutor stuff? I'll explain everything, Titus, I said, my heart breaking for the man he'd become under their thumb. But right now, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not say a word. Do not respond to them. Every word they speak from this moment on is evidence. Every sneer, every justification. Just let them talk. Oh, we'll talk. Philemon roared, stepping over the chair he'd knocked aside. He loomed over me, his chest puffed out like a bantam rooster. I don't care if you were the Pope. You're in my house. Threatening me? I'll have you thrown out. Violet, call the police. Tell them a senile old man is trespassing and making threats. Violet reached for her phone, her eyes darting between us. She was a creature of calculation, and she was trying to figure out which way the wind was blowing. Dad's right, she said, her voice trembling slightly. You come in here, into our home, and start acting like you own the place? You're the one who's out of line, Winfield. Titus was being disrespectful. My father was just. He was just being a father. You laughed, Violet, Titus said, his voice stronger now, though his lip was beginning to swell. He hit me, and you laughed. Because you were being pathetic, she snapped, the mask of the doting wife finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. You've been pathetic for years. Sitting in that room, clicking a mouse, making art, while my father has to step in and keep us afloat. You're lucky he even cares enough to hit you. I felt a cold shiver of disgust. I'd seen this dynamic before in my work. The enabler, who thrives on the victim's degradation. Violet wasn't just a bystander. She was the architect of Titus's shame. She had invited me tonight not for a reconciliation, but for a front-row seat to the final execution of my son's autonomy. They wanted me to see him broken, so I would stop being his anchor. They wanted his inheritance, and they wanted it now. "You mentioned the deed, Philemon," I said, ignoring Violet's outburst. "You said you hold it now. When exactly did that happen?" 6 months ago, Philemon bragged, leaning back against the table. Titus couldn't handle the taxes. He was drowning. I stepped in, paid off the arrears, and had him sign the property over to my holding company. I'm a generous man, Winfield. I let him stay here. But tonight the lease is up. I nodded slowly, a small, grim smile touching my lips. A holding company. Let me guess. Walter's Development and Holdings, or perhaps something more obscured. Philemon's eyes narrowed. How do you know that? Because men like you are painfully predictable, I said. You think you're a genius of finance, but you're just a bully with a notary stamp. You took advantage of a family member in financial distress to seize an asset below market value. In the legal world, we call that unconscionable conduct. And in the federal world, if that holding company has any other irregularities, it becomes a very interesting thread to pull. You can't do anything, Violet hissed. Titus signed the papers. He's an adult. It's legal. Legality is a spectrum, Violet, I said, and I've spent my life operating at the very sharp end of it. The distant wail of a siren cut through the rainy Seattle night. It was far off, but getting closer. Philemon's face shifted from red to a pale, sickly gray. He wasn't a man used to the consequences of his actions. He was used to being the biggest fish in a very small, muddy pond. You're bluffing, Philemon said, though he stepped back from me. You're just a bitter old man trying to scare me. I'm not trying to scare you, Philemon, I said, stepping toward him. I was shorter than him, older, and outweighed by 50 pounds of construction-fed muscle. But I had the weight of the law behind me, and he could feel it. I'm informing you. You hit my son. You humiliated him in front of his father. You tried to steal his home and his dignity. And you did it all while I was sitting at the table. I leaned in, my voice a whisper that only he could hear. I spent 20 years taking down men who make you look like a Sunday school teacher. I've dismantled empires built on blood and billions. You're just a contractor with a temper and a paper trail of unpaid LI taxes that I haven't even begun to look at yet. His eyes went wide. The mention of the LI taxes hit home. Every contractor has secrets, and Philemon's were written all over his nervous twitch. I didn't mean to hit him that hard, Philemon stammered. The first crack in the foundation. It was the heat of the moment. Titus, tell him I was just stressed. Titus didn't say a word. He just looked at Philemon, then at his wife, then at me. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking for a way to apologize. He was looking for a way out. The blue and red lights began to pulse against the dining room wallpaper, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the faces of the people who had tried to destroy my family. The siren died with a final, low moan right outside the front door. That will be Marcus, I said, checking my watch. 6 minutes. He's losing his touch. Violet started toward the door, her voice high and frantic. I'll handle this. I'll tell them it was a misunderstanding. Dad, hide the wine glasses. Titus, get up. Get off the floor and act normal. Stay where you are, Titus, I commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. The front door didn't just open. It was occupied. 2 uniformed officers stepped in, followed by a man in a sharp charcoal suit who looked like he hadn't slept since the 90s. Detective Marcus Reed scanned the room with the practiced efficiency of a hawk. His eyes landed on Titus on the floor, then moved to Philemon's flushed face, and finally settled on me. Winfield, Marcus said, his voice gravelly. You sound exactly the same on the phone. I almost checked my calendar to see if it was hanging in le lum again. Marcus, thank you for coming, I said. What is this? Philemon shouted, trying to regain his footing. Who authorized this? I want these people out of my house. Marcus didn't even look at him. He walked over to Titus, knelt down, and looked at the reddening mark on his face. Did he hit you, son? Titus looked at me. I gave him a small, encouraging nod. Yes, Titus said, his voice trembling but clear. He shoved me to the floor, and then he slapped me. My wife, she laughed. Marcus stood up slowly. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The family dinner was officially a crime scene. He turned to the uniformed officers. "Take Mr. Walters into the kitchen. Separate him from the witnesses. And ma'am," he said, looking at Violet, "you'll stay here with me." "You can't do this," Violet screamed. "This is my house. My father is a respected businessman." "Your father is currently a suspect in a domestic assault investigation," Marcus said, his voice flat and unimpressed. "And based on the statement I just heard, you might want to start thinking about your own role in this evening's festivities." As the officers led a suddenly silent, stumbling Philemon into the kitchen, I walked over to my son and reached out a hand. He took it, and I pulled him to his feet. He was shaking, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "It's okay, Titus," I whispered. "The storm is here, but I'm the one who brought it." I looked over at Violet, who was currently being read her rights by a very bored-looking Marcus Reed. She looked at me, her face twisted with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "We have the house, Winfield. We have everything. You're just going to end up paying for a lawyer Titus can't afford, and when this is over, he'll have nothing." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, velvet pouch I'd been carrying all evening. I opened it and let a single, heavy gold coin slide into my palm. It was in Motngin Tamchumlair bone, draped bust dollar, a king of coins. To the untrained eye, it was a piece of metal. To a collector, it was a $3 million insurance policy. "I didn't spend 35 years as a prosecutor because I needed the salary, Violet," I said, letting the gold catch the strobe of the police lights. "I did it because I enjoyed the work. My father was a collector, and his father before him. I don't live in a shack because I'm poor. I live there because it's where I keep the things that actually matter." I tucked the coin back into the pouch. "You think you have the house," I continued. "By the time I'm done with the forensic audit of your father's holding company, he won't even own the boots on his feet. And as for Titus, he's moving back into that shack with me tonight. We have a lot of history to catch up on." Violet opened her mouth to speak, but Marcus stepped between us. "That's enough, Winfield. Don't provoke the witness. I need to take your statement." "Of course, Detective," I said, stepping back. "I'll be as thorough as I always am." But as I watched them lead Philemon out the door in handcuffs, I knew this wasn't the end. Philemon was a bully, and bullies don't go quietly. He would call his lawyers, he would threaten, and he would use every dirty trick in his construction site playbook to avoid the consequences of that slap. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't just testifying, I was building a cage. As I walked Titus to my car, leaving the Ballard house behind, my son turned to me. "Dad, what did you mean about the L.I. taxes and the holding company?" I started the engine, the windshield wipers clearing the Seattle mist. "Titus, when a man like Philemon steals a house, he usually forgets to lock the back door of his own business. I've spent my life finding those doors." I pulled away from the curb, but in the rearview mirror, I saw Violet standing in the doorway of the house, her silhouette framed by the cold light of the hallway. She was on her phone, her face frantic. "Who is she calling?" Titus asked. "Probably her father's attorney," I said. "But it won't matter, because tomorrow morning, I'm calling the IRS." I looked at my son, his face bruised but his eyes finally clear. "I told you once that low expectations have their advantages, Titus. Philemon expected a victim. Violet expected a bank account. What they didn't expect was a predator who knows how to wait." The silence in the car was heavy, but for the first time in years, it wasn't uncomfortable. I had my son back. But as we drove toward Greenwood, I realized I'd made a mistake. I'd focused so much on Philemon and Violet that I'd forgotten one very important thing. Philemon wasn't the only one with secrets, and some of the secrets I'd uncovered about his business during my quiet retirement were far more dangerous than a simple tax audit. "Dad?" Titus asked again. "Why did you wait so long? If you knew they were like this, why let it go this far?" I gripped the steering wheel, the streetlights blurring in the rain. "Because, Titus, in a court of law, you don't just need the truth. You need the moment where the defendant proves they're beyond redemption. Tonight, they gave me that moment." But as we turned onto Tamuilumph Street, I saw a black SUV parked in front of my house. A man was standing by the gate, his face obscured by a hood. He wasn't the police, and he wasn't a lawyer. My blood ran cold. I had started the fire, but I had underestimated how fast it would spread. I saw the way Titus gripped the door handle of the Buick. His knuckles were white, and his breath hitched. After the violence at the Ballard house, His nerves were frayed to the point of snapping. In his mind, Philemon's reach was infinite. He expected retaliation to look like a man with a hood and a grudge waiting on our doorstep. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, but I didn't pull into the driveway. I kept the engine idling, the headlights cutting through the rain to illuminate the figure by the gate. The man didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just stood there, his posture military straight, watching us. "Dad," Titus whispered, his voice cracking. "We should go. Call Marcus back. That's one of Philemon's guys. I know it. He's got friends in the unions, guys who do the dirty work." "It's not one of Philemon's guys, Titus," I said, though my heart was still hammering against my ribs. I recognized the silhouette. It was a ghost from a life I had buried. I pulled the car to the curb and killed the lights. "Stay here. Lock the doors." "Dad, no." I ignored him and stepped out into the cold Seattle air. The rain felt like needles against my skin. As I approached the gate, the man stepped forward into the dim yellow glow of the street lamp. He pulled back his hood, revealing a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite, craggy, scarred, and familiar. "You're late, Winfield," the man said. His voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together. "I've been standing here for 20 minutes. The neighbors are starting to think I'm a burglar." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. "Arthur, what the hell are you doing here? It's been 3 years." Arthur Vance had been my lead investigator for over a decade. He was the man who found the bodies, the bank accounts, and the leverage that made my cases ironclad. When I retired, he'd gone into private consulting, which was a polite way of saying he became a high-priced ghost for people with very expensive problems. "I keep an eye on the dispatch logs, Winfield." "Old habit," Arthur said, nodding toward the house. "I saw your name pop up on a domestic call in Ballard. Witness, complainant, and a request for a tactical unit. I figured the harmless retiree finally ran out of patience." "I did," I said, leaning against the gate. "It's my son, Arthur. He's in the car. He's been through hell." Arthur's eyes shifted to the Buick, softening just a fraction. "The kid? Last time I saw him, he was graduating from UW. What happened?" "A parasite named Philemon Walters happened, and his daughter." Arthur whistled low. "Walters Construction. I know the name. I've done some digging on him for a client in the city council last year. The man is a walking OSHA violation with a gambling habit and a very creative way of filing his corporate taxes." "I need everything, Arthur," I said, my voice hardening. "Everything you have on him. Every contract. Every subcontractor he's stiffed. Every inspector he's bribed. I want the house of cards to fall, and I want it to fall tonight." Arthur reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, protected by a plastic sleeve. "I had a feeling you'd say that. I stopped by my office on the way over. Consider this a retirement gift, no charge." I took the envelope, the weight of it feeling like a weapon in my hand. "Why, Arthur? You don't work for free. You saved my daughter's life when that East Side gang went after her in Hang in Le Murbon, Winfield. I don't care how many years pass. My ledger with you is never going to be balanced. Now get that boy inside. He looks like he's about to faint." I thanked him, watched him disappear into the shadows of the street, and walked back to the car. Titus was staring at me as I climbed back in, his eyes wide. "Who was that?" he asked. "What did he give you?" "An old friend," I said, tossing the envelope into his lap. "And that, Titus, is the beginning of Philemon's end. Let's get inside." My house on Thamui Lemph Street didn't look like much from the outside. A weathered craftsman with peeling paint and a porch that groaned under a light footfall. Philemon had called it a shack. To him, wealth was something you flaunted. It was chrome and glass and high-end finishes. He didn't understand that true security is invisible. Once inside, I locked the deadbolt and led Titus into the kitchen. I made him a cup of tea, watching as he sat at the scarred oak table, his hands still trembling. The house was quiet, filled with the scent of old books and the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was the first time in months my son had been in a space where he didn't have to apologize for breathing. "I didn't know it yet," I said, sitting across from him. "But the moment I called Arthur, I crossed a line. I promised your mother I'd never cross again. I told her I was done with the war. But seeing you on that floor, the war came back for me." Titus looked at the envelope. "What's in here, Dad? Really?" "Evidence of a lifetime of fraud," I said. Philemon thinks he's a king because he controls his small circle through fear, but men like him always leave a trail. They think they're too big to be caught, so they get sloppy. They stop paying the people who keep their secrets. They stop hiding the bodies. "Why didn't you tell me you were doing this?" Titus asked, a hint of hurt in his voice. "All those times I came over here, feeling like a failure, listening to Violet talk about how you were just an old man who didn't understand the world. Why did you let me believe it?" I leaned back, the memories of the last few years rushing in like a cold tide. "Because I wanted you to find your own strength, Titus. I thought if I stepped in, I'd just be another man trying to control your life. I wanted you to see Violet for who she was on your own. I thought your love for her was real, and I didn't want to be the one to break it. I was wrong. I should have acted sooner." "It wasn't just love," Titus whispered, staring into his tea. It happened so slowly. You don't notice the water getting hotter until you're boiling. At first, it was just constructive criticism. She'd say, I was too sensitive, or that I needed to step up. Then she started handling the finances. Then she brought her father in to consult on my business. By the time I realized they were stripping me of everything, I was too exhausted to fight back. I watched him, my heart aching. This was the boiled frog of domestic abuse, the psychological grooming that turns a strong man into a shadow. "Do you remember the first time she showed you who she really was?" I asked. Titus nodded, a grimace flickering across his face. 2 years ago, Thanksgiving. You weren't there. She told me you were busy with a coin convention. I found out later she never even sent the invitation. We were at her parents' house. Philemon was bragging about a city contract he'd just landed by greasing the wheels. I made a comment about ethics, and the room went silent. Violet didn't defend me. She looked at me with this look of pure disgust. She told me to go sit in the car until I could act like a man. I went. I actually went and sat in the car for 2 hours while they ate dinner. He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. That was the day I should have walked away. But I thought it was my fault. I thought if I worked harder, made more money, was more manly, she'd love me again. She never loved you, Titus, I said, and the words felt like a scalpel. She loved the idea of a man she could mold, and when you didn't mold fast enough, she brought in the hammer, her father. We spent the next 3 hours at that kitchen table. I didn't just listen, I documented. I pulled out my legal pads and began building the timeline. I recorded every instance of financial coercion, every threat, every time Philemon had used his company to squeeze Titus's business. As the night wore on, the harmless old man was replaced entirely by the lead prosecutor. I saw the patterns. Philemon wasn't just a bully. He was a predator using his daughter as a lure. They hadn't just wanted Titus's house. They wanted his talent. They were using his graphic design skills to forge documents, to create professional-looking bids for contracts that Philemon's crew wasn't actually qualified for. "Wait," I said, tapping my pen against the table. "You said you did logoses and marketing materials for him. Did you ever see the final bid packages?" Titus frowned. "No. I designed the covers, the layouts, the safety certification pages. He'd give me the text to input. It always looked official." "Titus," I said, my voice low, "Philemon Walters hasn't had a valid safety certification in 3 years. If you were designing those pages with current dates, you weren't doing marketing. You were unwittingly committing felony fraud." Titus went pale. "What? No," he said. He said it was just for internal presentations. In the world of construction, internal presentations don't exist when you're bidding on government work, I said. I pulled a document from Arthur's envelope. It was a list of Philemon's recent city contracts. "Look at the dates. He used your work to secure the King County Bridge project, a project where 3 men were injured last month due to unforeseen structural failures." The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Titus realized then that the trap wasn't just financial, it was legal. If Philemon went down, he was prepared to take Titus with him, pointing the finger at the unstable freelancer who had falsified the documents. "He was setting me up," Titus whispered. "From the beginning, if the bridge collapsed, if anyone died, it would be my designs, my files." "What happened next changed everything," I said, standing up and heading toward my office. "Because Philemon Walters thinks he's playing a game of checkers. He has no idea that I've already set the board for a grandmaster's checkmate." I opened the door to my study. To Philemon, this room would have looked like a dusty library, but as I flipped the switch, the hidden servers hummed to life. The old coins were tucked away in a safe, but the real treasure was the digital archive I had been maintaining since my first day at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I had a copy of every major construction fraud case in the Pacific Northwest for the last 30 years. "Titus," I said, beckoning him into the room, "I'm going to show you why I never worried about Philemon's power. Because power isn't about how loud you can yell. It's about knowing which string to pull to make the whole curtain fall." But as I logged into my encrypted drive, a notification flashed on the screen. An alert from the security system at the Ballard house, the house Titus had just left. Someone was inside. And they weren't looking for the silverware. I pulled up the remote camera feed. Through the grainy night vision lens, I saw Violet. She wasn't crying. She wasn't frantic. She was methodically pouring gasoline onto the floor of Titus's office, the room where he kept his computer, his backup drives, and every piece of evidence of the design work he'd done for her father. "Dad," Titus gasped, pointing at the screen. "She's burning it. She's burning everything." I watched as she struck a match, the flicker of flame illuminating a face that looked entirely monstrous. "Let her," I said, my voice steady. "She thinks she's destroying the evidence. What she doesn't know is that the man she's married to is a graphic designer who syncs everything to a cloud server I've been paying for since their wedding day." I picked up the phone to call Marcus, but then I stopped. "Actually," I said, a dark thought forming, "let's wait 10 minutes. I want the fire department to arrive just in time to catch her with the lighter in her hand. Arson carries a much heavier sentence than simple assault." I looked at my son. "Tonight, Titus, you're going to learn the most important lesson I ever learned in the Justice Department. Never interrupt your enemy when they are making a mistake." But as we watched the screen, another figure entered the frame. A man I didn't recognize. He grabbed Violet's arm, blowing out the match. He whispered something in her ear that made her go limp with terror. He wasn't police. He wasn't Philemon. "Who is that?" Titus asked. I zoomed in on the man's face. He had a tattoo on his neck, a series of small black numbers. My heart stopped. "That," I said, "is a man I sent to Walla Walla for 20 years. He was released last week, and it looks like Philemon isn't the only one who has been waiting for me to come out of retirement." The man on the screen didn't look like a construction worker, and he certainly didn't look like a friend of the family. He looked like a predator who had finally found the scent he'd been chasing for 20 years. Silas Vane. I hadn't heard that name since I watched him being led out of a federal courtroom in Hainan-Laosao, screaming that he'd dance on my grave. Back then, he was the primary enforcer for the Cascade Syndicate, a group that had specialized in labor racketeering and accidental site collapses. Seeing him in the house I had helped my son buy, standing next to the woman my son had loved, sent a jolt of cold electricity through my veins. It wasn't just about a slap anymore. This wasn't a family dispute. It was a calculated infiltration. "Dad, what's happening?" Titus asked, his voice shaking as he watched the screen. "Who is that? Why is she listening to him?" On the monitor, Silas had his hand wrapped around Violet's upper arm. He wasn't hurting her, not yet, but his posture was dominant. He leaned in, whispering into her ear, and I saw her face go from panic to a terrifying, blank compliance. She set the lighter down on the desk. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a subordinate. "That man is Silas Vane," I said, my voice sounding foreign even to me, hollow, sharp, and lethal. "And the fact that he's in your house means Philemon Walters isn't just a bully. He's a front. He's the clean face for the people I spent my life putting in prison." "A front?" Titus whispered. "You mean my entire marriage? The house? Everything?" I didn't want to say the words. I didn't want to break what was left of my son's heart. But the truth was the only weapon we had left. "Titus, they didn't just pick you because you were a talented designer. They picked you because you were my son." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the air out of the room. Titus looked at the screen, then at the modest walls of my house, then back at me. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His 5 years with Violet, the wedding, the struggles, the debt, it hadn't been a tragedy of bad luck. It had been a long-term play. "They wanted to get to you," Titus said, his voice barely audible. "They used me to find out where you kept your records, where you kept the money they thought you'd stolen from the syndicate seizures." "I never stole a dime," I said. "But men like Silas can't imagine a world where a man has power and doesn't use it to line his pockets. They've been looking for my stash for years. They thought you were the key." On the screen, Silas and Violet moved toward the back of the house, out of range of the office camera. I immediately pulled up the feed for the hallway, but it went black. One by one, the cameras in the Ballard house were being neutralized. They knew about the security system. They knew exactly where the blind spots were. "We have to go back there," Titus said, standing up so fast his chair clattered to the floor. "We have to call the police, tell them there's an intruder." "No," I said, grabbing his arm. "If you call the police now, Silas will be gone before they hit the driveway, and Violet will play the victim. We need more than an intruder. We need to know what they're looking for." I led Titus back into the kitchen, my mind racing. My retirement had been a fortress, but I'd left the gate unlatched. I'd been so focused on being a harmless old man that I'd forgotten that vulnerability is an invitation to a wolf. My phone buzzed on the table. It wasn't a text this time. It was a private number. I answered it and put it on speaker. "Winfield," a voice rasped. It wasn't Silas. It was Philemon, but the blustering, red-faced contractor was gone. In his place was a man who sounded cold, calculated, and entirely in control. "I hear you had a little chat with Detective Reed tonight. Very dramatic, very heroic." "Where are you, Philemon?" I asked. "The police told me you were being processed." "The police are very manageable when you know which unions they're hoping to join after they retire," Philemon laughed. "I was out on bail before your son even finished his statement. But that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling to tell you that I'm standing in your garden, Winfield. The one with the hydrangeas. You really have a green thumb." Titus let out a choked sob, but I pressed a finger to my lips. I walked silently toward the back door, peeking through the blinds. The yard was dark, the rain blurring the shapes of the bushes, but I saw the glow of a cigarette near the shed. "You're trespassing, Philemon," I said into the phone. "That's a violation of your bail conditions. I could have you back in a cell in 10 minutes. "You could," Philemon agreed, his voice smooth. "But then you'd never find out what Violet found in your son's design files. You know, Titus is a very meticulous boy. He saves everything, even the things he doesn't realize he's saving. Like the encrypted metadata from the emails you sent him from your private server." My heart skipped a beat. I had been careful. I thought I had been perfect. But I had used Titus's business email to send him links to his trust fund documents, thinking the encryption was enough. I hadn't accounted for the fact that the person sitting next to him while he opened those emails was a spy. "What do you want?" I asked. "I want the ledger, Winfield. The one from the Hang In Lea Bone Syndicate bust. The one with the names of the judges and the council members who weren't indicted. You kept it as insurance, didn't you? A little stay-out-of-jail-free card for your retirement." "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied. The ledger was real. It was the only reason I was still alive. It was buried in a place no one would ever think to look, not in a safe, not in a bank, but in plain sight. "Silas thinks you're lying," Philemon said. "And Silas is very impatient. He's currently with your daughter-in-law, discussing how much Titus's life is worth to you. I'd say it's worth a dusty old book, wouldn't you?" "Leave Titus out of this," I growled. "Oh, he's already in it, Winfield. He's been in it since the day he met Violet at that coffee shop in Queen Anne. Did you really think a woman like that would fall for a starving artist like him without a reason? She's been on the payroll since she was 20. Titus sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. The humiliation was total. His entire romantic history, the memories he cherished, the us against the world narrative Violet had spun, it was all a mercenary contract. "I'll give you the ledger," I said, my voice steady. "But I want Violet and Silas out of that house, and I want you off my property. Meet me at the Ballard house in 20 minutes, alone. If I see a single patrol car, Silas starts the fire. And this time, he'll make sure there's something inside the house that you can't replace." The line went dead. I looked at the backyard. The cigarette glow was gone. Philemon was moving. "Dad, you can't go there," Titus said, looking up. His eyes were red, but the shock was being replaced by a cold, sharp anger. "He'll kill you. He doesn't want the ledger. He wants to eliminate the witness." "I know," I said. I went to the hallway and opened the grandfather clock. I reached behind the weights and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It wasn't the ledger. It was a decoy I'd prepared years ago for this exact scenario. "Then why go?" "Because," I said, while Philemon was busy playing gangster in my garden, he forgot that I still have Arthur Vance on the payroll. And Arthur doesn't just collect evidence. He collects leverage. I handed Titus my car keys. "I want you to drive to the North Precinct. Don't go inside yet. Just wait in the parking lot. If you don't hear from me in 30 minutes, go to Captain Morrison and tell him the Greenwood archive is active. He'll know what it means. I'm not leaving you, Dad, Titus said, standing his ground. They've spent 5 years making me feel like a coward. I'm not going to prove them right tonight. I looked at my son. He wasn't the brittle man I'd seen at dinner. He was taller, his jaw set, the bruise on his face looking like war paint. For the first time, I saw my own reflection in him, not the prosecutor, but the fighter. All right, I said, but we don't go in the front door. Philemon thinks he's the one setting the trap. We're going to remind him that in this city, I own the courthouse and the shadows beneath it. We took my old Buick, driving without headlights for the last 3 blocks. The Ballard house was dark, but I could see the faint shimmer of flashlights moving in the upstairs windows. Silas and Violet were still searching. They were desperate. As we stepped out of the car, I felt the weight of the moment. I had spent my life following the rules, believing in the system, but as I looked at the house where my son had been tortured emotionally for years, I realized that the system wasn't enough. What happened next was a blur of calculated risks. I whispered to Titus as we crept through the neighbor's yard. But remember this, a man like Philemon relies on fear. A man like Silas relies on violence. But a man like me? I rely on the fact that everyone has a price they can't afford to pay. We reached the back porch. The smell of gasoline was still faint in the air, a reminder of Violet's failed arson attempt. I reached for the spare key I knew Titus kept under a loose stone, the one Violet didn't know about. But as my hand touched the stone, a shadow fell over us. Looking for this? I turned. It wasn't Philemon, it was Violet. She was holding the key, a cruel, jagged smile on her face. In her other hand, she held a suppressed pistol, pointed directly at Titus's chest. You really should have taught him better, Winfield, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. He was so easy to play, and now he's going to be so easy to lose. I looked at the woman I had once welcomed into my family, and for the first time, I didn't see a parasite. I saw a professional. Violet, I said, stepping in front of my son. You're making a very expensive mistake. No, she said, cocking the hammer. I'm finally getting a promotion. At that moment, the front door of the house exploded, not with a bomb, but with the sound of a dozen flashbangs. The night turned into a blinding white chaos of screams and shattered glass. I didn't know it yet, but the Greenwood archive wasn't the only thing that had been activated tonight. The world turned into a strobe light of white heat and thunder. A flashbang is designed to do more than just blind you. It overloads the sensory cortex, turning your equilibrium into a spinning compass in a magnet factory. I felt the shockwave rattle my teeth, but I didn't wait for my vision to clear. I had spent 3 decades preparing for moments of total collapse. I lunged forward, not for Violet's gun, but for Titus. I tackled him into the damp hydrangea bushes just as the first crack of a suppressed round hissed through the air where his chest had been a second before. Violet screamed, but it wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of frustrated rage. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard the heavy boots of a tactical team, not the police, but Arthur Vance's private recovery crew, breaching the front door with a rhythmic, mechanical violence. The Greenwood archive wasn't just a collection of files, it was a distress signal. The moment I had deactivated the house's secondary security loop back at my place, it had sent a GPS ping to Arthur. Stay down, I hissed into Titus's ear. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and fixed on the silhouette of his wife as she retreated into the shadows of the porch, still holding that cold, professional-grade pistol. She tried to kill me, Dad, he whispered, the words trembling with a realization more painful than the slap he'd taken earlier. She didn't even hesitate. I squeezed his shoulder, my eyes fixed on the house. She was never your wife, Titus. She was an assignment. And Silas Vane doesn't like it when his assets miss their mark. Inside the house, the chaos was surgical. Flashlights cut through the smoke in sharp, sweeping arcs. I heard Silas's voice, a gravelly, prehistoric snarl ordering someone to get the girl and get to the basement. Philemon was shouting too, but his voice was high and thin. The sound of a man who had realized too late that he'd invited a shark into his backyard pond. Philemon wasn't the king of this castle. He was the jester. He had thought he was using the syndicate's muscle to expand his little construction empire, but Silas was the one holding the leash. The slap at dinner hadn't been Philemon's idea of discipline, it had been a test. Silas had wanted to see if I would break cover. He had wanted to see if the lead prosecutor was still alive behind my bifocals, and I had given him exactly what he wanted. Winfield. Silas's voice boomed from the shattered remains of the living room window. "Tell your dogs to stand down, or I'll start with the contractor's fingers and move on to your daughter-in-law. She's failed me, but she still has a very pretty face. It would be a shame to lose the investment." I stood up slowly, raising my hands. Titus tried to grab my coat, but I brushed him off. I needed him to stay in the shadows. "Arthur, hold fire!" I shouted. The strobing lights died down, replaced by the flickering orange glow of a fire that had started in the kitchen. The gasoline Violet had poured earlier was finally finding its purpose. The smoke was beginning to billow out of the eaves, thick and black. I walked toward the porch, my heart a steady, heavy drum. I wasn't afraid. Fear is for people who have something left to lose, and in that moment, seeing my son's life nearly extinguished by the woman he'd loved, I felt a vacuum of emotion that made me dangerous. I was no longer a father or a retiree. I was the man who had burned down the Cascade Syndicate 20 years ago, and I was more than happy to do it again. "Where's the ledger, Winfield?" Silas was standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the fire behind him. He held Philemon by the scruff of his neck. The contractor looked pathetic. His nose was broken, blood soaking into his Walters construction jacket. His eyes glazed with terror. "The real one, not the toy you keep in the clock." "It's not in the house, Silas," I said, stopping at the bottom of the steps. "And it's not at my place. You've spent 5 years using Violet to search for something that doesn't exist in a physical form." Violet appeared beside Silas, her face streaked with soot. She looked at me with a hatred so concentrated it felt like a physical weight. "He's lying, Silas. I saw the encrypted pings. He's been accessing the syndicate's offshore routing numbers from his study. He has the keys." I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of pity. "Violet, you were so busy looking at my screen that you never looked at the source. I wasn't accessing your accounts. I was feeding them." The confusion on her face was almost satisfying. "Every time you spied on my sessions over the last 2 years," I continued, my voice carrying over the crackle of the flames, "you were actually downloading a Trojan horse into the syndicate's main server. I knew you were there, Violet. I knew from the first week. I let you stay because I needed a direct line into Silas's network, and you were the perfect, greedy little conduit." Silas's grip on Philemon tightened. His eyes shifted to Violet, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "What is he talking about?" "He's trying to get in your head," she screamed, though her voice wavered. "He's an old man playing games." "Am I?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming remote. "Silas, check your phone. If your network is still active, you should have received a notification 30 seconds ago. A transfer. All the syndicate's untraceable funds, the ones you've been hoarding since your release, just moved." Silas didn't take his eyes off me, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out a burner phone. I watched his thumb scroll. The color drained from his face, leaving the scars on his neck looking like jagged white lightning. "Where?" he rasped. "Where did the money go?" "To a court-ordered escrow account held by the U.S. Marshals," I said, "along with a complete manifest of every bribe Philemon Walters paid to city inspectors, every fraudulent bid Titus was forced to design, and the exact location of the bodies you buried under the King County Bridge, footings in High-in-Le-Bon. I didn't need a ledger, Silas. I just needed you to get desperate enough to check your balance." What happened next changed the stakes from a standoff to a massacre. Silas, realizing his entire empire had just evaporated in a digital puff of smoke, didn't turn his gun on me. He turned it on the person closest to him. He didn't even look at Violet as he backhanded her with the grip of his pistol, sending her sprawling across the porch. Then, he shoved Philemon down the stairs. The contractor tumbled like a bag of wet cement, landing at my feet, groaning in agony. "You think I care about the money?" Silas snarled, stepping off the porch. He ignored the tactical lights now surrounding the house. He ignored Arthur's men. He was a man with nothing left but the need to see the architect of his ruin suffer. "I can make more money, but I can't get back the 20 years you took from me, Curtis. I'm going to kill your son while you watch, and then I'm going to let this house burn with you inside it." He raised his weapon, aiming past me toward the bushes where Titus was hiding. "Titus, run!" I yelled, but I knew he couldn't. Silas was a professional marksman, but I had one more loop to close. "Silas," I barked, my voice echoing with the authority of the federal government, "look at the roof." A red laser dot appeared on Silas's chest. centered perfectly over his heart, then another on his forehead, and another on his throat. "The tactical team isn't Arthur's," I said, the lie finally dropping away. "Arthur was just the distraction to get you into the open. Those are federal snipers, Silas. I didn't call Detective Reed tonight to report an assault. I called the FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force. We've been waiting for you to violate your parole since the second you stepped onto this property." Silas froze. The rage in his eyes was replaced by the cold realization that he had been played from the very beginning. He wasn't the hunter. He was the bait. "Drop the weapon, Silas," a voice boomed from a megaphone at the street. "Now." Silas looked at the gun in his hand, then at me. He knew the math. If he pulled the trigger, he'd be dead before Titus hit the ground. For a second I saw him weigh the cost of revenge against the cost of survival. He dropped the gun. But Violet didn't. She had crawled back to her feet, her face a mask of blood and soot. Her eyes dilated with a psychotic break. She grabbed the suppressed pistol she'd dropped and leveled it at me. "You ruined everything," she shrieked. "We were going to be rich. We were going to have it all." "Violet, don't," I said, stepping toward her. "It's over." "It's not over until I see you bleed." She pulled the trigger. I felt the hot sting of the bullet graze my shoulder, but the sound of her shot was drowned out by a deafening volley of return fire. The porch railing shattered into toothpicks. Violet was thrown backward into the burning house by the force of 3 high-caliber rounds. "Dad!" Titus was out of the bushes, sprinting toward me as the tactical team swarmed the yard, pinning Silas to the ground and dragging a sobbing, broken Philemon toward an ambulance. I slumped against the side of my Buick, my hand clutching my shoulder. The blood was warm, soaking through my shirt, but the pain felt distant. I watched the Ballard house, the symbol of my son's misery, become a funeral pyre. The flames were licking the sky now, lighting up the neighborhood like a second sun. Titus reached me, his hands shaking as he tried to examine my wound. "You're hit, Dad. You're hit." "I'm fine, son," I said, though my head was swimming. "Just a scratch. I've had worse from a paper cut at the office." I looked over at the porch. Violet was gone, swallowed by the smoke and the fire. She had been the most successful manipulation of my life, and she had died believing her own lies. As the paramedics rushed toward us, I saw Arthur Vance walking up the driveway. He looked at the burning house, then at Silas being loaded into a van, and finally at me. "You always did like a big finish, Winfield," he said, lighting a cigarette. "I didn't want a big finish, Arthur," I whispered. "I just wanted my son back." "Well, you got him," Arthur said, nodding toward Titus, who was refusing to leave my side even as the medics tried to push him away. "But you know this isn't the end of the paperwork, right? The syndicate has deep roots. You just cut off the main branch, but the roots are still in the soil." I looked at Titus, then back at the flames. I didn't know it yet, but the real reversal was still to come. Because while Silas and Violet were dead or in custody, there was one person we'd all forgotten about. Someone who had been watching from the shadows of the holding company since the very beginning. "Dad," Titus said, his voice urgent as he looked at my phone, which had fallen onto the pavement. "You have a message from an unknown sender." I picked up the phone with my good hand. The screen was cracked, but the text was clear. "Thanks for clearing the path, Winfield. I'll take it from here." It was a photo of my house on Tamwi Lumpth Street, and standing in the front window, holding my mutngin tamcham lea bone silver dollar, was a person I hadn't seen in 25 years. My blood ran cold. The revenge wasn't over. It was just changing hands. The adrenaline of the firefight was a dirty fuel, and as it began to evaporate, it left behind a cold, hollow H that had nothing to do with the bullet graze on my shoulder. The paramedics were a blur of blue latex and bright flashlights, their voices distant and clinical as they pressed gauze against my skin. Titus was a frantic anchor at my side, his hands stained with the soot of his own life's wreckage. But my eyes were fixed on the cracked screen of my phone, on the image of a woman who shouldn't have been standing in my living room. She looked exactly as she had the day she died in the winter of Heinginlaer, with the same sharp, angular jawline, the same eyes that looked like frozen emeralds. Claire, my wife, Titus's mother. I had told my son she was a victim of a hit and run, a tragic casualty of a rainy Seattle night. I'd buried a closed casket and spent 25 years mourning a ghost. I didn't know it yet, but the fire at the Ballard house was just the warm-up. The real arson had started decades ago. "Dad, you're shaking," Titus said, his voice cutting through the ringing in my ears. "The medic said it's shock. We need to get you to the hospital." "I'm not going to the hospital," I rasped, pushing the paramedic's hand away. I stood up, the world tilting on its axis for a heartbeat. I showed the phone to Titus. "Do you recognize her?" Titus took the phone, squinting at the grainy image. He looked at the woman holding my mutngin tamchamlair bone silver dollar, a coin worth more than the house she was standing in, and then he looked back at me, his expression blank. "No. Should I? Is she one of Silas's people?" "She's the woman I told you was buried in Lakeview Cemetery," I said. Titus froze. The color didn't just leave his face, it seemed to vanish from his soul. "Mom? No. That's impossible. You showed me the police reports. You showed me the grave. I showed you what I needed to believe," I said, a bitter taste rising in my throat. "I thought the syndicate had killed her to get to me. I thought I was protecting you by giving you a clean memory instead of a messy reality. But look at her, Titus. She isn't a prisoner. She's holding the king of coins like she's checking an old friend's pulse." The realization hit us both like a second shockwave. If Claire was alive, and if she was working with the people who had sent Violet to infiltrate Titus's life, then the last 5 years weren't just a scam. They were a homecoming. The drive back to Temwe Lemth Street was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I ignored the throbbing in my shoulder and the sirens of the fire trucks heading the opposite way. My shack, my sanctuary, the place where I had carefully curated a life of quiet anonymity, felt like a crime scene before we even arrived. I pulled the Buick to the curb, but I didn't get out immediately. I sat there, staring at the porch light. It was glowing yellow, warm and inviting, exactly as I'd left it. But the front door was slightly ajar. A silent invitation. "Titus, stay in the car," I commanded. "Not this time, Dad," he said, and I saw a hardness in him that hadn't been there at dinner. The slap from Philemon had broken his spirit, but the betrayal from his mother was forging something new. Whatever is in that house, we face it together. We walked up the path, our footsteps heavy on the wet wood of the porch. I kicked the door open, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy brass lamp by the entryway, the only weapon I had left. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. The scent of Claire's perfume, something sharp and expensive, like sandalwood and ozone, hung in the air, a ghost of a memory that made my lungs seize. The living room was ransacked, not with the chaotic violence of a burglar, but with the surgical precision of someone who knew exactly where the seams were. My books were pulled from the shelves, their spines cracked. My coin display cases were smashed, the velvet trays stripped of their contents. But the vault, the one hidden behind the false back of the grandfather clock, was wide open, and it was empty. "It was never about the ledger, was it?" Titus whispered, walking into the center of the room. He picked up a discarded photo from the floor, a picture of him as a toddler, sitting on Claire's lap. She had torn herself out of the image, leaving only Titus's small, lonely hand, reaching into a white void. "No," I said, leaning against the doorframe as my strength began to fail. The ledger was the bait I used to keep the syndicate away. But the coins were the retirement fund she knew I was building. She didn't want the names of corrupt judges. She wanted the untraceable wealth. I walked to the kitchen. On the oak table where we had sat just hours ago, drinking tea and planning our defense, was a single object. It was the motngin tam chum lea bone silver dollar. She hadn't taken it. She'd left it there, pinned to the wood with a steak knife. Underneath the coin was a note, written in a hand I would have known anywhere. "Winfield, you were always so good at the law, but you were terrible at the people. You spent 30 years putting men in cages, never realizing you'd built one for yourself. Thanks for the seed money. Tell Titus he looks just like his father, weak in the eyes, but stubborn in the heart." I sank into a chair, the weight of the last 3 decades finally collapsing on top of me. I had hit rock bottom. I had lost my house, my life savings, and the one thing I thought I'd protected, my son's innocence. I had been the lead prosecutor, the man who knew everything, and I had been played by my own wife for a quarter of a century. "She's gone, isn't she?" Titus asked, standing by the window. "She's been gone for 25 years, Titus," I said. Tonight was just the final withdrawal. "So, what do we do?" he asked. He turned to face me, and I saw the reflection of the fire from the Ballard house still dancing in his eyes. "The police can't help. She's dead on paper. Philemon and Silas are in custody, but they're just the distraction. How do we find someone who doesn't exist?" I looked at the silver dollar pinned to the table. I looked at the blood on my sleeve and the ruins of my home. And then I felt it, a flicker of the old. cold clarity. The part of me that didn't care about the law. The part of me that knew that when the system fails, you don't call a cop, you call a debt collector. We don't find her, Titus, I said, my voice dropping into a low, dangerous hum. We make her come back. She thinks she's the only one who knows how to play a long game, but she forgot one thing. What's that? She forgot that I'm the one who taught her how to hide. The reversal began at home a.m. I didn't call Detective Reed. I didn't call the FBI. I called Arthur Vance, who was currently overseeing the cleanup at the Ballard house. Arthur, I said, change of plans. I don't want Silas processed yet. I need 10 minutes with him in the back of the transport van. Alone. Winfield, that's a federal violation, Arthur warned. If Morrison finds out, Morrison won't find out, because Morrison is currently dealing with the fallout of an arson and a shootout. I snapped. Silas knows where she is. He's the only link left. If he goes into the system, he'll be silenced before he hits the yard. I need him now. Give me 10 minutes, Arthur said. I turned to Titus. You wanted to face this together. This is where the law ends. This is where we become the people they think we are. Are you ready to see what your father is really capable of? Titus didn't hesitate. He picked up the steak knife from the table, sliding the motngin tam chamlea bone silver dollar into his pocket. I've spent 5 years being a victim, Dad. I'm ready to be the prosecutor. We drove to a secluded construction yard near the Ship Canal, one of Philemon's abandoned sites. Arthur was waiting, his black SUV idling in the shadows. A transport van was parked next to it, its back doors slightly ajar. He's inside, Arthur said, leaning against his fender. Handcuffed to the rail. The cameras are glitching for the next 15 minutes. Whatever you do, Winfield, don't leave a mark that a doctor can find. I stepped into the back of the van. The smell of sweat and fear was thick in the air. Silas Vane was slumped against the wall, his face a mask of bruises. When he saw me, he tried to spit, but he didn't have the energy. Come to finish it, Curtis, he rasped. Go ahead. I've survived worse than a retired lawyer. I didn't say a word. I sat down on the bench across from him and pulled out my phone. I showed him the photo of Claire in my living room. Where is she taking the money, Silas? He laughed, a wet, hacking sound. You're pathetic. Your own wife. She's been the one running the Cascades since Hangin Lermoor. Silas Vane, I was just the muscle. Philemon, he was the laundry. Claire, she's the brain, and she's already halfway to Vancouver by now. She's not going to Vancouver, I said, leaning in close. She's going to the one place where she can convert the King of Coins into liquid capital without raising a red flag. The auction house in Macau, the one your syndicate has been using for years. Silas's eyes widened, just for a fraction of a second. It was all the confirmation I needed. She thinks she's out, I continued. She thinks because the world believes she's dead, she can walk into that auction and disappear with 50 million in laundered assets. But I'm going to give her a choice. She can give me back my son's life, or I can make sure the Macau authorities know exactly who is carrying those coins. You can't touch her in Macau, Silas sneered. The syndicate owns the port. Maybe, I said, standing up. But they don't own the man I'm about to hire. I stepped out of the van, the cold wind off the canal biting at my face. Titus was waiting, his hands buried in his pockets. He talk? Arthur asked. He confirmed what I already knew, I said. Claire is the head of the snake. The last 5 years with Violet. It was a psychological harvest. They wanted to see how far they could push us, before we broke. They wanted to see if I'd lead them to the vault. And you did, Titus said, a note of realization in his voice. The fight at the Ballard house. It was a distraction for us, too. While we were fighting Silas, she was at the shack. Exactly, I said. But the reversal is this. She thinks she took the real King of Coins. She thinks that piece of silver she pinned to the table was a message. I looked at Titus. Son, give me the coin. Titus reached into his pocket and handed me the silver dollar. I held it up to the moonlight. It was beautiful, heavy, and perfect. This is the Motngin Tamcham Lairbon, draped bust, I said, but it's a high-fidelity counterfeit I had made 10 years ago. The real one, the one worth $3 million, it was never in the vault. I walked over to the Buick and opened the trunk. I pulled back the carpet, revealing the spare tire well. I reached into a hidden compartment and pulled out a small, unassuming wooden box. Inside, wrapped in silk, were 12 coins, the real collection. She spent 25 years planning a heist for a box of fakes, I said, a grim satisfaction settling in my chest. She's currently on a plane with a bag of metal that will get her arrested the moment she tries to authenticate it. She's not rich, Arthur. She's a target. So what's the plan? Titus asked. The plan, I said, is that we let her get to Macau. We let her realize she has nothing. And then, we show her what happens when you spend 30 years making an enemy out of the man who knows where all the bodies are buried. I looked at my son, the man who had been slapped, humiliated, and betrayed by everyone he trusted. Titus, I said, how would you like to take a trip to China? I think it's time you had a real conversation with your mother. But as we prepared to leave, a black sedan pulled into the yard, blocking our exit. The windows were tinted, the engine purring like a cat. The door opened, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out. He wasn't syndicate. He wasn't FBI. He was someone I hadn't seen since the day I retired. Winfield, the man said, adjusting his tie. The Attorney General is very unhappy. It seems you've accidentally dismantled a federal investigation that's been running for a decade. And now, I'm here to tell you that if you step on that plane to Macau, you're not going as a father, you're going as a fugitive. I looked at the man, then at my son, then at the box of coins in my hand. I didn't know it yet, but the revenge wasn't just against Claire. It was against the very system I had served, and to win, I was going to have to burn every bridge I had ever built. Special Agent Thomas Miller didn't look like a man who had spent a decade undercover. He looked like a man who spent his weekends at a yacht club, his cufflinks gleaming under the harsh industrial lights of the construction yard. But I knew Miller. I had signed off on his first field budget 10 years ago. Back then, he was hungry. Now, he just looked compromised. A fugitive, Thomas, I said, leaning against the cold metal of my Buick. I didn't let the box of coins show. My good arm was steady, even as the blood from my shoulder began to stiffen my shirt. That's a heavy word for a man who just handed you Silas Vane and the entire Cascade Syndicate leadership on a silver platter. You didn't hand them to us, Winfield, Miller snapped, his voice tight. You blew the roof off a 10-year RICO investigation. We had Silas under surveillance. We were weeks away from identifying the ghost at the top of the chain. Then you go and start a localized war in Ballard. The syndicate is scrubbing their servers as we speak. You didn't solve the case. You burned the evidence. I looked at him, and I didn't see a federal agent. I saw the bureaucracy that had let my wife's death go uninvestigated for 25 years. I saw the system that had allowed Titus to be dismantled by a two-bit contractor and a high-end spy. I didn't know it yet, but Miller wasn't there to arrest me. He was there to protect the people I was about to expose. The ghost at the top isn't a secret anymore, Thomas, I said, my voice dropping into that dangerous low-frequency hum. It's Claire Curtis, my wife. The woman your department declared dead in Hang In Lam Moat. If your investigation was so thorough, why didn't you find her pulse? Why did it take an old man and his son to find the heart of the syndicate in a Ballard dining room? Miller's jaw tightened. He didn't look surprised. That was the first red flag. In my world, a lack of surprise usually meant prior knowledge. The situation with your wife is complex. There are national security interests involved. If you go to Macau, you are interfering with a sanctioned operation. I'm telling you now, Winfield, stay out of it. Go back to your shack. We'll handle Claire. Titus stepped forward, the steak knife still gripped in his hand, though he didn't raise it. He looked at Miller with a gaze that had aged a decade in a single night. Handle her. You let her marry me off to a predator. You let her steal 5 years of my life. You let her burn my house. You don't handle her, Agent Miller. You protect her. Because if she talks, she tells the world which federal agents have been on the syndicate's payroll for the last 20 years. The silence in the construction yard was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Titus had hit the bullseye. I hadn't even told him about the syndicate's federal ties, but he'd figured it out. He wasn't a victim anymore. He was a prosecutor in the making. That's a dangerous accusation, kid, Miller whispered. I'm not a kid, Titus said, and the accusation isn't dangerous. The evidence is. I reached into the Buick and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive, the physical manifestation of the Greenwood archive. I held it up between my fingers. This drive is currently synced to a dead man's switch, Thomas. If I don't check in with a secure server every 6 hours, the contents are uploaded to every major news outlet, from the Seattle Times to the New York Times. It contains the ledger Claire thought she was looking for. Not the names of syndicate enforcers, but the names of their silent partners in DC and Seattle. I took a step toward Miller, ignoring the two agents who shifted their hands toward their holsters. You want to talk about being a fugitive? If you block my path to that airport, I'll make sure you're the most famous man in the federal prison system by dawn. Now, get your cars out of my way. Miller stared at me for a long, agonizing minute. He was calculating the cost of a shootout against the cost of exposure. He knew I wasn't bluffing. I had spent my life building cases. I wasn't going to lose the final one because of a suit with a yacht club membership. Move the cars, Miller ordered, his voice trembling with a suppressed fury. As his team cleared the exit, he leaned in toward my window. You think you're the hunter, Winfield? Claire is expecting you. She left that coin on the table because she wanted you to follow her. She's not running. She's setting the final stage. If you go to Macau, you're walking into a slaughterhouse. I've lived in a slaughterhouse for 30 years, Thomas, I said, putting the Buick in gear. I'm used to the smell. We didn't go to SeaTac. Miller would have flagged us the moment we hit the TSA checkpoint. Instead, we drove north toward a private airstrip in Snohomish. Arthur Vance was already there, standing next to a Gulfstream that looked like it belonged to a tech billionaire. The pilot is an old friend, Arthur said, handing me a clean shirt and a fresh medical kit. No flight plan on the books. You'll stop in Anchorage, then Tokyo, then a private barge into Macau. By the time the DOJ realizes you're out of the country, you'll be on the floor of the Lisboa casino. Why are you doing this, Arthur? Titus asked as he helped me patch the wound on my shoulder. This is a lot more than a retirement gift. Arthur looked at the plane, then at the bruised, bloodied son of his old boss. Because for 20 years, I watched your father do the right thing and lose everything. I watched him bury a wife who was a monster and raise a son who was a target. Just once, I want to see the bad guys lose to someone who isn't afraid to get his hands dirty. We boarded the plane in silence. As the engines roared to life and the gray Pacific Northwest landscape began to shrink beneath us, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in my life, I wasn't a servant of the law. I was a father on a warpath. But the peace didn't last. 3 hours into the flight, as we crossed over the Alaskan wilderness, Titus opened the wooden box I'd pulled from the Buick, the one containing the real coins. He was methodically checking each one, his designer's eye looking for the minute details of authenticity. Dad, he said, his voice sounding hollow. What is it, Titus? He held up the Motngin Tamcham Lair bone silver dollar, the real one, the centerpiece of the collection. This one. It's different. I frowned, taking the coin from him. I had owned this piece for 15 years. I knew every nick on Liberty's face, every star on the rim. But as I held it, I felt a slight, imperceptible weight difference. I turned it over. On the reverse, near the eagle's wing, was a microscopic engraving that hadn't been there when I put it in the box. I pulled a magnifying loupe from my pocket and leaned in. Property of the Curtis estate. Phase 2. My heart plummeted into my stomach. I hadn't been hacked. I hadn't been followed. The real coins had been switched years ago. Claire hadn't waited until tonight to rob me. She had been living in my house, in the shadows, for years. She had replaced the real coins with her own authentic counterfeits, waiting for the moment I would finally feel safe enough to pull them out of the vault. She wanted me to bring these to Macau, I whispered, the horror of the realization washing over me. The coins she took from the Ballard house were the fakes I made. She knew I had a second set. She wanted me to think I was the one outsmarting her, so I would bring the real collection directly to her buyer. Why? Titus asked. If she already had them, why not just take them and run? Because the Macau auction requires a provenance verification, I said. They don't just need the coins, they need the owner to authenticate them in person. They need a former U.S. attorney to stand there and swear they're part of a legitimate estate. I'm not just the hunter, Titus. I'm the authenticator. The trap was so elegant it was almost beautiful. Claire hadn't just stolen my money, she had stolen my reputation to launder her final score. And by running from Miller and the DOJ, I had played my part perfectly. I was now a fugitive, a man with no legal standing, carrying a box of high-value assets into a foreign jurisdiction where Claire held all the cards. What happened next was the moment I finally hit rock bottom, I told Titus, staring at the coin, because I realized that my wife didn't just know me, she had mastered me. She knew that if she hurt you, I'd stop at nothing to get revenge. She used my love for you as the engine for her escape. So we turned the plane around, Titus said. No, I said, a cold, hard light returning to my eyes. If she wants an authenticator, I'll give her one. But I'm going to add a few more names to the Curtis estate before the hammer falls. We landed in Macau 48 hours later. The city was a neon hallucination, a forest of gold-plated skyscrapers and emerald lights rising out of the South China Sea. It was a place where the law was a suggestion and money was the only language spoken fluently. A black Mercedes was waiting for us at the private pier. No one asked for our passports. No one checked our bags. We were ushered into the back seat by two men in suits who looked more like soldiers than chauffeurs. The car wound through the narrow streets of the old quarter, eventually stopping in front of a colonial-style mansion hidden behind a wall of banyan trees. This wasn't a casino. It was a private club, the kind of place where the world's most dangerous secrets were bought and sold over glasses of vintage cognac. "Welcome home, Winfield," a voice said as we stepped into the marble foyer. Claire was standing at the top of a grand staircase. She was wearing a dress the color of midnight, her hair pinned back in a sharp, professional bun. She looked like a queen, but as she walked down the stairs, I didn't see the woman I'd married. I saw the parasite that had been feeding on my life for 3 decades. She didn't look at me. She looked at Titus. "You've grown, Titus," she said, her voice like velvet and broken glass. "You have your father's chin. It's a pity you have his heart, too." Titus didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the fake silver dollar she'd left pinned to the table in Greenwood, and threw it at her feet. The silver clattered on the marble, a hollow, tinny sound. "I don't have his heart, Mother," Titus said, his voice flat. "I have his memory, and I remember everything you did to us." Claire laughed, and it was the same sharp, mocking sound I'd heard from Violet at the dinner table. Like mother, like daughter-in-law. The realization that Claire had likely handpicked Violet to be the ultimate instrument of Titus's torture made my blood boil. "Memory is a liability in this business, Titus," Claire said, turning to me. "Winfield, you look tired. The bullet grazes a bit much, don't you think? I told Silas to be careful with the hardware." "You told Silas to kill us, Claire," I said. "Don't play the doting wife now. The authenticator is here. Let's get this over with. Business first." "I like that," Claire said. She gestured toward a pair of heavy mahogany doors. "The buyer is waiting. He's very interested in the Curtis collection, especially the Motngin Tam Cham Lair Bone Dollar. He wants to hear the story of how a federal prosecutor managed to acquire such a rare piece on a government salary. The story is that I'm a better collector than you are a thief," I said. We walked into the room. It was a library, filled with the scent of old paper and expensive tobacco. A man was sitting in a high-backed leather chair, his face obscured by the shadows. On the table in front of him was a velvet tray, waiting for my coins. "Agent Miller was right about one thing," I whispered to Titus as we approached the table. "She was setting the stage, but what she doesn't know is that I brought a different script." I placed the wooden box on the table. My hands were steady. I opened the lid, revealing the 12 real counterfeits Claire had planted in my vault years ago. "Here they are," I said, looking at the man in the chair. "The Curtis collection, authenticated and delivered by the owner himself." The man leaned forward into the light. My heart stopped. It wasn't a foreign buyer. It wasn't a syndicate leader. It was Philemon Walters. He was wearing a suit that cost more than his construction company. His face perfectly reconstructed. No sign of the broken nose or the bruises Silas had given him. He smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. "Thanks, Dad," Philemon said, reaching for the Motngin Tam Cham Lair Bone silver dollar. "I knew you'd bring them eventually. You were always so predictable." I looked at Claire. She was smiling. I looked at Titus. He was pale. I hadn't just walked into a trap. I had walked into a family reunion I wasn't invited to. "Wait," I said, the words catching in my throat as I looked at Philemon. You weren't the pawn. I'm the son Claire kept." Philemon laughed, standing up to his full height. "Titus was the experiment. I was the heir. And now, Winfield, you're going to give us the final piece of the puzzle." The room began to spin. The hidden truth was far worse than anything I had imagined. I hadn't just been married to a monster. I had been raising a target while her other son was the one holding the gun. "The final piece?" I rasped. Philemon pulled a document from the table. It was a confession. A confession stating that I, Winfield Curtis, had stolen the syndicate's assets 20 years ago and used my position to frame Silas Vane. "Sign it," Claire said, stepping behind me. "Sign it, and Titus lives to see tomorrow. Refuse, and he joins the hit and run list." I looked at my son. I looked at my wife. I looked at the man who had slapped my son and was now revealed as his half-brother. I was at the absolute bottom. But as I picked up the pen, I felt a small, hard object in the palm of my hand. The motngin tamcham lair bone silver dollar Titus had thrown at Claire's feet. He had picked it up. He had slipped it to me when we entered the room. And, I realized, the fake coin wasn't just a prop, it was a flash drive. The silence in that mahogany-lined library was heavy enough to crush the lungs. I looked at the pen in my hand, then at the document that would turn my 35 years of service into a criminal footnote. Across from me, Philemon Walters, or whatever his real name was, smirked with a level of chilling entitlement that only comes from a lifetime of being told, "You are the rightful heir to a throne of blood." "Sign it, Winfield," Claire whispered, her hand resting almost tenderly on my shoulder. It was the same touch she'd used to comfort me when my father died, the same touch she'd used to tuck Titus into bed. It felt like a viper's coil. "Don't make this harder on Titus. He's already lost so much. Let him go home. Let him live a quiet, unremarkable life. It's what you always wanted for him, isn't it?" I looked at Titus. He was standing near the window, 2 of Philemon's men flanking him. He wasn't looking at the guns pointed at him. He was looking at Claire, the mother he'd mourned, the woman he'd built an altar to in his memory. The betrayal in his eyes was so profound, it made my own wounds feel trivial. I felt the hard, cold edge of the silver dollar Titus had slipped me. It was pressed against my palm, a secret weight. I knew my son. I knew the way his mind worked, meticulous, creative, always thinking in layers. He hadn't just given me a piece of metal, he'd given me the king of coins. "You're right, Claire," I said, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. "I always wanted him to be safe. I spent my life building walls to keep the world out, never realizing the wolf was already in the nursery." I picked up the pen. I hovered it over the signature line. "One question," I said, looking up at Philemon. "When did you find out? When did you realize your mother was the one running the show?" Philemon leaned back, crossing his legs. "When I was 12. She didn't die in a hit-and-run, Winfield. She just moved me to a boarding school in Switzerland, while you were busy playing hero in the district attorney's office. She visited me every month. She told me all about the boring man she'd married to keep the heat off. You were the perfect camouflage, a high-profile prosecutor with a spotless record. No one looks for a crime syndicate in the basement of a saint." "And Titus?" I asked. "Was he ever part of the plan?" Claire's expression softened into something truly monstrous pity. "Titus was a mistake, Winfield, a biological necessity to keep the cover story believable. I tried to love him, in my own way, but he was always so much like you, soft, ethical. He was never going to be what Philemon is." "I see," I said. I lowered the pen and signed the name Winfield Curtis with a flourish. Philemon snatched the paper away, his eyes gleaming. "There, the ghost is officially exonerated, and the great Winfield Curtis is a common thief. We'll have this filed with the D.O.J. through our channels by morning. Silas Vane will be out of custody within the week, and you, well, you're a fugitive in a country with no extradition. Enjoy your retirement, Dad." "Wait," I said, as they started to lead us toward the door. "You forgot the coins. The authentication isn't complete." Claire paused, her eyes narrowing. "We have the coins, Winfield. The experts will handle the rest." "No," I said, reaching out and grabbing the motngin tamcham lea bone silver dollar Titus had given me. I held it up. "You have the high-fidelity fakes you planted in my house. And you have the ones I made to trick you. But you don't have the key." I walked over to the table where a high-end laptop was open, presumably for the buyer to monitor the transaction. I didn't wait for permission. I slid the silver dollar into the side of the machine. The metal casing of the coin retracted with a mechanical hiss, revealing a gold-plated USB connector. "What are you doing?" Philemon barked, reaching for his weapon. "I'm showing the buyer what he's actually paying for," I said. The screen flickered to life, but it didn't show a list of coins. It showed a live feed of a boardroom. I recognized the faces immediately, the heads of the 3 major triads in Macau, the men who actually controlled the ports and the casinos. They were sitting around a table, their expressions grim, and they were listening. "You see, Claire," I said, turning to face her as the color drained from her face. Philemon mentioned that he's been running the ghost accounts since he was 12. He talked about how he skimmed the syndicate's seizures to build his construction empire. He talked about how the family was just a shield for his own greed. The laptop's speakers crackled. A voice, cold and ancient, spoke in Cantonese. The translation appeared on the screen in real time. "Mrs. Curtis, your son has very loose lips. He speaks of the syndicate as his personal bank. He speaks of the families as his jester. We do not pay for jester, we pay for loyalty." "It's a deep fake," Philemon screamed, lunging for the laptop. "He's using a filter." "It's not a filter, Philemon," Titus spoke up, his voice echoing with a cold, sharp clarity. "I'm a graphic designer, remember? But I'm also a systems architect. While you were busy slapping me in Ballard, I was installing a mirroring protocol on the server you forced me to build for you. Everything you've said in this room for the last hour has been broadcast directly to your investors in Macau." I looked at Claire. The Queen was crumbling. She realized that I hadn't come here to save my reputation. I had come here to start a civil war. "You killed me once, Claire," I said, stepping toward her. "You let me mourn you for 25 years. You used my son as a pawn in your game of shadows. But you forgot the first rule of the courtroom. Never ask a question you don't already know the answer to." I pulled a second device from my pocket, a small, black transmitter. "Arthur Vance isn't just a private investigator. He's a liaison for the Macau Maritime Police. They've been waiting for a reason to raid this mansion for years. They just needed the local triads to stop protecting you. And thanks to Philemon's ego, the protection just ended." The sound of helicopters began to throb in the distance, a low, rhythmic vibration that shook the windows. The heavy mahogany doors were kicked open, but it wasn't the police who entered first. It was the guards who had been standing at the staircase. They didn't point their guns at us. They pointed them at Claire and Philemon. The triads had made their decision. "Wait," Claire shouted, her voice shrill and desperate. "Winfield, think about what you're doing. I'm the mother of your son." "No," Titus said, walking past her to stand by my side. "You're just the woman who laughed when I was hit. My mother died 25 years ago. I'm just here to see the ghost laid to rest." The scene that followed was a blur of tactical precision and clinical violence. The maritime police swarmed the room, but the syndicate's own men had already disarmed Philemon and Claire. They were handed over like discarded trash. In the world of international crime, there is no sin greater than being caught stealing from the hand that feeds you. As they were being led out in chains, Philemon turned to me, his face twisted with a pathetic, childish rage. "You think you won. You're still a fugitive. You signed the confession. You're going to die in a Chinese prison." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the confession I'd signed. I held it up, then slowly tore it into pieces, letting the fragments flutter to the marble floor like snow. "I signed it Winfield Curtis, Philemon," I said, "but I haven't been Winfield Curtis in 35 years. My legal name, the one on my birth certificate and my federal commission, is Winston Curtis." Winfield was just the name Claire liked. In a court of law, that document is as fake as your construction licenses. The look of utter defeat on his face was the most satisfying verdict I had ever delivered. The sun was rising over the South China Sea as Titus and I stood on the deck of the police cutter, heading back toward the mainland. The air was salt-heavy and cool, the neon lights of Macau fading into the morning mist. Arthur Vance was waiting at the pier in Hong Kong. He didn't say a word. He just handed us 2 new passports and a pair of plane tickets to Seattle. The DOJ dropped the charges. "Winfield," Arthur said, leaning against a bollard. "Agent Miller was reassigned. It turns out the Greenwood Archive had some very interesting things to say about his yacht club fees. You're a free man, both of you." "And Claire?" I asked. "She and the boy are being held by the local authorities. The triads want their money back. I don't think they'll be seeing a courtroom. They'll be lucky if they see the sun again." I looked at Titus. He was staring out at the horizon, the wind ruffling his hair. He looked older, yes, but the hunched posture was gone. The shadows under his eyes had cleared. He looked like a man who had finally stepped out of a dark room and into the light. "What now, Dad?" he asked. "Now," I said, "we go home. We fix the roof on the shack. We look at the coins that are left. And I tell you the truth about everything. No more secrets, Titus. No more protecting you from things you're strong enough to handle." He smiled, and for the first time, it reached his eyes. "I'd like that. But Dad? Yeah? Can we stop by a Safeway on the way home? I really want some Honeycrisp apples. I laughed, a deep, genuine sound that felt like it was breaking a 20-year seal on my soul. Yeah, Titus, we can do that. 6 months later, the house on Tamwilumph Street was quiet. The rain was drumming a peaceful rhythm against the new shingles, and the smell of cedar and old books filled the air. Titus had moved into the guest suite, his graphic design business now thriving under his own name. He wasn't a freelancer anymore. He was a consultant for the city's ethics board, helping them design systems to track construction fraud. Violet had disappeared into the anonymity of the Midwest, working a dead-end job and living a life of quiet consequence. Philemon and Claire were names we didn't speak anymore. They were ghosts, and ghosts have no power over the living. I sat in my study, the $1 bone silver dollar sitting on my desk. It was the real one this time. I'd found it in a safety deposit box. Claire had forgotten about the one she'd opened in my name back when she still thought she could love me. I looked at the coin, its silver surface reflecting the dim light of the lamp. People often ask me if I regret the lives I destroyed. They ask if a prosecutor's job is to seek justice or to seek revenge. I've learned that the answer is neither. A prosecutor's job is to ensure that the truth is so loud it can no longer be ignored. I didn't destroy Philemon Walters. I didn't ruin Claire. I simply took away the masks they used to hide from the world. The destruction that followed was their own making. Justice isn't a hammer, it's a mirror. And sometimes, the most terrifying thing you can show a person is exactly who they are. Titus knocked on the door, holding 2 mugs of tea. Hey Dad, you coming? The sunset is supposed to be incredible tonight. I stood up, leaving the king of coins on the desk. It was just a piece of metal after all. The real wealth was standing in the doorway. Coming, son, I said. We walked out onto the porch together, 2 men who had been through the fire and come out tempered. The sky was turning a brilliant, defiant orange, and as I watched the light fade over Seattle, I finally understood what my father had tried to tell me all those years ago. You can tell everything about a person by how they treat someone who can do nothing for them. But you can tell even more by what they do when they finally have the power to take it all back and choose, instead, to walk away. I had my son. I had my peace. And for a man like me, that was the only verdict that mattered.